let's talk about reduce. Now, reduce is probably the trickiest of all array methods. So it's okay if it seems really overwhelming as we're going through it. But I promise you that once it clicks, it will make total sense. And it's actually one of the most useful array methods that we have in our repertoire as JavaScript developers. So in order to understand it, let's go into our browser. Let's say I had some array which was equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, let's say I wanted to add all the values inside of my array. How would I do this? Well, we could write a for loop, right, where we add all the values together and end up with some final value. Or this is actually the perfect time to use reduce. Reduce is a great array method to use when we want to do two things. The first is that we want to end up with one value in the end, right? Not an array, but some value in the end. The second is when we want to persist the return or the outcome of iterating over our elements in each subsequent iteration. Now, what do I mean by that? That's a mouthful, right? Well, let's take a look at how the code actually looks, and then maybe it'll be better for us to understand. Let's say I call array.reduce. Array.reduce takes two arguments. The last argument we won't focus on for now. Let's just focus on the first argument. The first argument is a function, and that function has two parameters. The second parameter is the element itself. So it's the current element that we're on, that we're iterating over. The first one is what's called the accumulator, right? The accumulator is exactly as it sounds. It's the accumulated value of calling this function on every element before the one that we're currently on. So what we would do if we wanted to add all these numbers together is if we said accumulator plus our current element. And what we would pass to our second argument is 0. Now you might be wondering, well, what's the first value that accumulator has when we start at the first element? Well, that's actually what this second argument is. And that's why we pass it 0, because we want to add all of these values together. We want to start from 0. And if we call this, oh, I think I have an extra bracket by accident, we will get 15. Now, let's walk through how this works. So the first time this function gets called, accumulator is 0, right? And 1 is the current element. So it'll be 0 plus 1, right? Which gives us a value of 1. Then it moves on to the next element. And here, accumulator will get the return of our last function call on this element, which is 1. So accumulator is 1, current element is 2, and we'll get 1 plus 2, which equals 3, right? So 3 gets passed as the accumulator in the next element when this function is called, and we'll get 3 for accumulator and 3 for current element. So we get 3 plus 3, which is 6, which then gets passed as the accumulator for the next element, which is 4. So accumulator of 6, current element of 4, 6 plus 4 equals 10, and then finally one more time on 5, where 10 is the accumulator, the current element is 5, and that's how we end up with a value of 15. And this is how the reduce function works. Now, you don't necessarily have to start with 0, right? We only did this because the purpose of what we were trying to achieve was to add all the values together, right, in our array. But if we wanted, all this second argument symbolizes is the first accumulator value when we get called on the first element. So if I said that this was 10, what happens is that 10 gets passed as the accumulator when this function first gets called on 1. So it's 10, current element is 1, 10 plus 1 is 11, which gets then passed as the accumulator when we call it on 2, right? 11, current element is 2, 11 plus 2, 13, and so on and so forth for each subsequent element until we end up with 25. So this is how we write reduce. Now there's a lot more complicated ways that we can use reduce, but the basics, the fundamentals of how reduce works is in what we just wrote. Now, it's okay if you don't grab it all right away. It's a lot, and it's always one of the trickier parts of understanding this specific array method. Now, we will definitely encounter more opportunities to use reduce throughout our course. But right now, I want you to just maybe play around with some of this array that we already have, right? Play around with some of the numbers so that you get a familiar feel for it. But in the future, when we encounter opportunities to use reduce, we'll definitely slow down and take a look at how we're writing our code so we can better understand how to write reduce and when it's actually a good solution. But understanding reduce and knowing when to use it will be a very powerful tool in our careers as JavaScript developers.